I was born the fourth child of 9 in a family so poor that meat on our table was a memory, not a meal. By the time I was 40, I owned property in Manhattan and lived as a wealthy man. Now, if you believe this transformation happened through hard work, through luck, through any external means whatsoever, you have missed the most important discovery any man can make. Listen carefully, my friend. The difference between the boy who went hungry in Barbados and the man who dined well in New York was not circumstance, it was not opportunity, it was not education or connections or any advantage the world recognizes. The difference was a single assumption I made about myself when every fact in my world denied it. Most who hear me speak of assumption believe they understand what I mean. They do not. They assume wealth while feeling poor and then wonder why their assumption fails to harden into fact. Tonight I will tell you exactly what I assumed, how I sustained that assumption when my senses screamed against it, and why most fail where I succeeded. The assumption I made was simple. I assumed I was a wealthy man. Not that I would become wealthy, not that I hoped to be wealthy. I assumed I was already wealthy, and I lived in that assumption until it hardened into fact. But let me tell you how this came to be, my friend, because the story will show you the law in operation. I was 28 years old, living in a single room in New York, working as a dancer on the stage. My family back in Barbados thought I had made something of myself in America. They did not know I was barely surviving. I would write home and speak of opportunities, but I slept on a narrow bed in a room so small I could touch both walls with outstretched arms. One evening, walking through Manhattan after a performance, I passed a row of fine brownstone houses. Warm light glowed from tall windows. I could see glimpses of elegant rooms, beautiful furnishings, the life of prosperity I had never known. And in that moment, something shifted in me, not hope, not longing, but a sudden knowing that this was my natural state. I belonged in such surroundings. I was meant to live this way. Most would call this fantasy. I call it recognition, for in that moment I did not desire wealth. I recognized myself as already wealthy. The feeling was not of wanting, but of remembering, as though I had temporarily forgotten who I was, and now I remembered. From that night forward, I began to live from that assumption. When I walked the streets of Manhattan, I walked as a wealthy man walks. When I looked at fine restaurants, I looked as one who belonged there. When I passed expensive shops, I felt the naturalness of entering them, not as a visitor, but as one for whom such places existed. Now, you must understand something here, my friend. I did not pretend to be wealthy. The world will tell you this is pretense, this is self-deception. I tell you they are wrong. Pretense is conscious deception, and it feels false to the one pretending. What I did was assume wealth as my natural state. There is a vast difference. When you assume something, it feels true to you. When you pretend something, you know it is false. But hold this thought. There is a specific feeling that tells you the assumption has taken root. And without recognizing that feeling, you will not know whether you are truly assuming or merely hoping. I will give you that feeling in just a moment, for it determines whether your assumption becomes fact or remains fantasy.
This assumption had to be maintained against tremendous evidence to the contrary. My bank account showed dollars, not hundreds or thousands. My room remained small.
My meals remained simple, but these facts became less real to me than my assumption of wealth. I lived more truly in my assumed state than in my apparent circumstances. The world, however, began to test this assumption immediately. A week after I began this inner work, I was let go from the theatrical company. My income stopped entirely. Now most people would abandon their assumption of wealth when faced with unemployment, but I tell you this apparent setback only strengthened my resolve, for I understood that the world was rearranging itself to match my new assumption. The old circumstances had to dissolve before the new could appear. I maintained my assumption through 3 months of unemployment. 3 months when logic screamed that I was deluding myself. 3 months when well-meaning friends told me to be practical, to take any job, to accept my circumstances. But I knew what they did not know. Consciousness is the only reality, and I had changed my consciousness from poor to rich. And then the externalization began. A man I had met briefly at a theater contacted me about a business opportunity. Within 6 months, I was earning more than I had ever imagined possible. Within 2 years, I was living in the kind of home I had assumed was mine. The assumption, though false when I began it, had hardened into fact exactly as the law promises. Now, I want you to understand what actually happened here. I did not create wealth out of nothing. I recognized wealth as my natural inheritance and accepted it as already mine. The creative power was not in my effort, but in my assumption. The moment I assumed I was wealthy, the universe began to rearrange circumstances to make that assumption fact. But here is where most people fail, and I must tell you this clearly. They assume wealth on Sunday and return to poverty consciousness on Monday. They feel rich during their morning meditation and feel poor when they pay their bills. This wavering between states is why their assumption never hardens into fact. Let me share with you another story that illustrates this perfectly. Many years ago, when I was lecturing in Los Angeles, a woman came to me after one of my talks. She had been applying what she called the law of assumption for over a year, she said, but her financial circumstances remained unchanged. She was a secretary earning barely enough to support herself and her elderly mother. I asked her to describe exactly what she was doing. She told me she spent 30 minutes each morning visualizing wealth, imagining herself in beautiful clothes, living in a fine home, having abundance. But then she said something that revealed her error. She said, "But of course, Mr. Goddard, I know this is just imagination. In reality, I am still poor." There was her mistake, my friend. She was using imagination as escape from reality instead of using it to create reality. She assumed wealth for 30 minutes and poverty for the remaining 23 and a half hours of each day. Her dominant assumption was poverty, not wealth. You have heard me speak of imagination, and many have misunderstood me. Let me be plain. Imagination is not fantasy. Imagination is not escape from reality. Imagination is the creative power of God in man, and what you imagine with feeling must become fact. When you call it just imagination, you rob it of its power. Now I must tell you something most teachers will not. There is a precise moment in each day when your assumption either strengthens or dissolves. And missing that moment is why most who study the law see no results. I will tell you that moment next, for it determines everything. I told her this truth: your assumption is not what you think about for 30 minutes. Your assumption is the state from which you think all day long. If you assume poverty 23 hours and wealth 1 hour, you are assuming poverty. The law responds to your dominant assumption, not your occasional imagination. At first, she resisted this. She said it was impossible to feel wealthy when her bank account proved otherwise. How could she assume wealth when she struggled to pay rent? But I persisted with her because I saw she truly desired to understand. Remember what I told you about my own experience in that small room in Manhattan? The same principle applies here. I told her to begin living from wealth consciousness immediately, not to deny her current circumstances, but to live from the feeling that wealth was her natural state. When she paid her modest rent, to pay it as a wealthy woman temporarily occupying simple quarters. When she wore her simple clothes, to wear them as a wealthy woman dressing casually. When she ate her humble meals, to eat them as a wealthy woman choosing simple foods. The shift was not in what she did, but in the consciousness from which she did it. She began to move through her days from the assumption of wealth rather than from the assumption of limitation. She came to see me again 6 weeks later. Already things were shifting. Her employer had noticed qualities in her he had never seen before. She carried herself differently. She spoke with quiet confidence. Within 3 months, she had been promoted to a position with twice her former salary. Within the year, she had married a man of means who recognized in her the consciousness of his equal. Her assumption had become her reality. You see, my friend, the secret is not in the visualization. The secret is in the assumption from which you live. Wealth consciousness is not something you put on for a few minutes each day. It is something you live from continuously until it becomes your natural state. But I must address the deepest error I see in those who try to apply this law. They assume the feeling of wealth means the feeling of having money. This is not correct. Do not be misled by teachers who tell you to visualize money, to imagine bank statements, to picture dollar bills. They have not understood the law. The feeling of wealth is the feeling of security, of confidence, of knowing you belong in the world's finest places and situations. It is not about money at all. Money is merely one expression of wealth consciousness. When I assumed I was wealthy, I did not visualize dollar bills. I assumed the feeling of security, the feeling of belonging in prosperity, the feeling of being at home in abundance. That assumption of consciousness naturally attracted its corresponding material expressions, including money. But money was the effect, not the cause. Consciousness was the cause. Now I want to give you the exact method I used because many of you will go home tonight and attempt this, and I want you to succeed. The method is simple, but it requires persistence until the new assumption becomes natural. But before I tell you how to apply this tonight, there is one detail about the moment just before sleep that determines whether any assumption takes root or evaporates. Miss this detail and you will practice the technique but never enter the state. I must address that now. Tonight, when you prepare for sleep, you will do this. First, as you lie in your bed, you will enter that drowsy state between waking and sleeping. In that state, the conscious mind releases its grip. An assumption can take root in consciousness itself. Second, you will feel yourself into the assumption of your wish fulfilled. Not visualize it, but feel yourself already being what you desire to be. If it is wealth you desire, feel the security, the confidence, the naturalness of abundance. Let this feeling become more real than the bed you lie upon. Third, you will not strain to maintain this feeling, but you will rest in it as you would rest in a comfortable chair. The feeling should be natural and effortless, like settling into your true home after a long journey. Fourth, you will fall asleep within this assumption, letting it be the last thing in consciousness as you drift into sleep. In sleep, the assumption moves from conscious thought into the deeper levels where creation occurs. And fifth, you will awaken the next morning from this assumption. Not to this assumption, but from it. You will begin your day already established in the consciousness of your wish fulfilled. But here comes the test, my friend, and most fail precisely here. The world will immediately present you with evidence that contradicts your assumption. Your bank account will show the same amount. Your circumstances will appear unchanged. Your friends and family will treat you exactly as before. Now I must insist on this, my friend. This is not failure. This is the natural process. Do not let anyone, including yourself, talk you out of your assumption the moment you see contradictory evidence. The assumption must first become established in consciousness before it can express in the world. But if you waver the moment you see contradictory evidence, you return to your former state and nullify all your inner work. I maintained my assumption of wealth for months while every external fact denied it. But I knew this truth. Assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. The key word is persisted. Most assume for a day or a week. The law requires persistence until the assumption becomes fact. Do not be misled by teachers who tell you the change will be immediate. Sometimes it is, but often it requires patience. I tell you with certainty, based on my own experience and the experience of thousands who have proven this law, if you persist in your assumption without wavering, it must externalize. This is law, not hope. The world is yourself pushed out, my friend. What you see around you is what you have assumed about yourself made visible. If you see limitation, you have assumed limitation. If you see lack, you have assumed lack. But the moment you change your assumption, you set forces in motion that must change your world to match. Make no mistake about this. You are not at the mercy of circumstances. Circumstances are at the mercy of your assumptions. The boy who was born poor in Barbados became the man who lived wealthy in Manhattan, not through any change in circumstances, but through a change in assumption. What I did, you can do. What I proved, you can prove, but only if you understand that assumption is not a technique you practice. Assumption is a state you live from. Live from wealth consciousness, and wealth must appear. Live from lack consciousness, and lack will persist. The choice, as always, is yours. And now I tell you the secret that transforms everything, my friend. When I assumed I was wealthy in that small room in New York, I did not imagine wealth. I did not visualize wealth. I became wealth. I entered the state of wealth and lived from it. The assumption was not something I did. The assumption was something I became. And from that state of being, the world had no choice but to conform. This is the difference between those who succeed and those who fail. They practice assumption. I lived assumption. Tonight, when you retire, enter the state of your wish fulfilled. Not for practice, but for keeps. Feel yourself already being what you desire to be. Rest in that assumption as you would rest in your own home. That is all. You may awaken tomorrow to find your world beginning to shift, or you may need to persist in this assumption for days or weeks. Both are well, my friend. Both are part of the law's perfect operation. Never forget this truth. Consciousness is the only reality. What you assume about yourself becomes the facts of your world. The boy from Barbados became the man of Manhattan not through circumstances, but through assumption. May you live tonight in the feeling of your wish fulfilled. May your assumption take root in the fertile soil of sleep. May you awaken tomorrow from the consciousness of your desire realized. The choice is always yours to make. Choose well. Until we meet again, my friend, may you live from your assumption as though it were already fact.